The world did not fall into darkness all at once. It happened in shadows, in whispers, and in the steady, rhythmic thud of jackboots on cobblestone. Imagine a world where the maps we know were being erased and redrawn in blood. This is not just a history lesson. This is the story of the greatest cataclysm in human existence. This is the full account of World War II. The seeds of the conflict were sown in the very soil that was supposed to bring peace. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles ended the Great War, but it left behind a Germany that was bankrupt, humiliated, and hungry for a savior. That savior arrived in the form of a failed painter with a gift for hypnotic oratory. Adolf Hitler didn't just seize power, he fed on the desperation of a nation. By the mid-30s, the Rhine was remilitarized, the Luftwaffe was born in secret, and the world looked away, hoping that if they gave the tiger what it wanted, it would stop growling. They were wrong. On September 1st, 1939, the silence of the Polish border was shattered by the roar of panzer tanks. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was a terrifying new way of fighting that the world had never seen. While the Polish cavalry fought with desperate bravery, they were no match for the coordinated strikes of dive bombers and armored divisions. Within weeks, Poland was crushed between two giants as the Soviet Union moved in from the east, fulfilling a secret pact between Hitler and Stalin. The era of peace was dead. The following spring, the German war machine turned west. Denmark fell in a day. Norway followed. Then came the fall of France, a nation thought to have the strongest army in Europe. In just 6 weeks, the impossible happened. Paris was occupied, and the British Expeditionary Force was backed into the sea at Dunkirk. Only a miracle of small boats and civilian courage saved the British Army from total annihilation. Britain stood alone, a small island facing a continent of steel. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with a mixture of horror and hesitation. Isolationism was the mood of the day. Americans remembered the trenches of the First War and had no desire to send their sons back to European soil. But President Franklin Roosevelt knew the danger. He began a quiet transformation of the American economy, turning factories that once made cars into engines of war. The Lend-Lease Act became a lifeline for a struggling Britain, but it would take a tragedy in the Pacific to finally bring the sleeping giant to its feet. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was designed to knock the United States out of the Pacific before it could even start. Instead, it ignited a fire that would consume the world. The American people, once divided, were now united by a singular purpose. The industrial might of the United States was unleashed on a scale the world had never imagined. As the Americans joined the fight, the theater of war expanded to every corner of the globe. In the burning sands of North Africa, British and American forces clashed with the legendary desert fox, Erwin Rommel. In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army was being ground into dust by a Soviet resistance that refused to break. Stalingrad was the turning point in the East. It was a war of attrition where human life was spent like water. Millions died in the snow, marking the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. While the soldiers fought on the front lines, a darker horror was unfolding in the heart of Europe. The Holocaust was a systematic attempt to erase an entire people from the earth. Behind the lines of the advancing German army, the machinery of death was working at peak efficiency. 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, were murdered in gas chambers and killing fields. It remains the darkest stain on the soul of humanity. By 1944, the tide had truly turned. The Allies were ready to strike at the heart of occupied Europe. Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, was the largest amphibious assault in history. On the beaches of Normandy, thousands of young men jumped into the cold Atlantic surf under a hail of lead. They fought for every inch of sand. Their sacrifice opened the door to the liberation of France and the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, the war was a brutal struggle for every tiny island. From the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima to the jungles of Guadalcanal, the Marines fought an enemy that believed surrender was worse than death. The island-hopping campaign brought American forces closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, but the cost was staggering. The end came in a flash of light, brighter than 1,000 suns. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the nature of warfare forever. They brought the Empire of Japan to its knees and ended the most destructive conflict in history. When the smoke finally cleared in 1945, the world was forever changed. Empires had crumbled, new superpowers had risen, and the shadow of the nuclear age began to loom. We remember this story not just to honor the fallen, but to ensure that the darkness of those years never returns. This was World War II, the struggle for the future of civilization itself. To understand how the world reached that breaking point, we have to go back to the end of the first great conflict, the war that was supposed to end all wars. In 1919, the halls of the Palace of Versailles were filled with diplomats who were more interested in vengeance than a lasting peace. They forced Germany to sign a document that stripped them of their territory, their pride, and their future. The German economy was crippled by massive reparations, leading to a period of hyperinflation so severe that a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People were burning their life savings just to keep their homes warm. In this atmosphere of chaos and despair, the radical fringes of politics began to grow like a fever. While Germany struggled, Italy was also in turmoil. Disappointed by their meager gains after World War I, the Italian people looked to a charismatic former journalist named Benito Mussolini. He promised a return to the glory of the Roman Empire. His black shirts marched on Rome in 1922, and the king, fearing a civil war, handed him the reins of power. Mussolini became Il Duce, the leader, and established the world's first fascist state. He suppressed dissent, took control of the media, and began to build a cult of personality. This model of totalitarianism would soon be studied and perfected by a young political agitator in Munich named Adolf Hitler. Hitler's rise was not immediate. After a failed attempt to seize power in 1923, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, he was sent to prison. It was there that he wrote his manifesto, outlining a vision of racial purity and territorial expansion he called Lebensraum, or living space. He believed the German people, whom he called the Aryan race, were destined to rule the continent. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, the fragile stability of the German Republic collapsed. Millions were unemployed, and the Nazi Party saw their opportunity. They used the new technology of radio and film to spread their message of hate and hope. By 1933, through a combination of political maneuvering and street violence, Hitler was appointed chancellor. Within months, he had dismantled the democratic institutions of the state and declared himself the Führer. The rest of the world watched with a sense of uneasy detachment. In the United States, the focus was inward, dealing with the breadlines and bank failures of the Depression. In Britain and France, the memory of the trenches was still too fresh. They were willing to do almost anything to avoid another slaughter. This policy became known as appeasement. When Hitler began to openly defy the Treaty of Versailles by rebuilding the German army and navy, the League of Nations issued protests but took no action. In 1935, Mussolini launched an unprovoked invasion of Ethiopia. The League of Nations proved powerless to stop him.
In 1936, Hitler marched his troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone on the border of France. This was a massive gamble. If the French had resisted, the German army would have been forced to retreat in disgrace. But the French stayed behind their defensive Maginot Line, and Hitler's confidence grew. That same year, the Spanish Civil War broke out, providing a grim laboratory for the new weapons of modern war. Hitler and Mussolini sent troops, planes, and tanks to support the nationalist forces of General Francisco Franco. The bombing of the city of Guernica showed the world for the first time what happens when modern air power is unleashed on a civilian population. By 1938, Hitler was ready to expand his borders. He forced the unification of Austria with Germany, an event known as the Anschluss. Next, he turned his sights on the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. The world held its breath. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to meet with Hitler. He returned waving a piece of paper, declaring he had secured peace for our time. He had agreed to let Hitler take the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further expansion. It was a hollow victory. Within months, Hitler's troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. It was now clear to everyone that Hitler could not be stopped by signatures on a page. The focus shifted to Poland. Britain and France finally drew a line in the sand, guaranteeing Polish independence. But Hitler had one more trick up his sleeve. In August 31, 1939, the Polish border was quiet. German agents, dressed in Polish uniforms, staged a fake attack on a German radio station to provide a pretext for invasion. At 4:45 a.m. the next morning, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on a Polish transit depot. It was the first shot of a war that would span 6 years and 6 continents. The Polish army, though large, was outdated. They were facing a new kind of coordinated warfare. German Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, destroying communication lines and spreading terror. Armored panzer divisions bypassed strongpoints and raced deep into the rear, cutting off any hope of retreat. While the world waited for France and Britain to strike from the west, they found themselves in a period of eerie calm known as the Phony War. For months, the great powers of Europe stared at each other across the border, but no major land battles took place. This gave the German High Command time to refine their plans. They knew that a frontal assault on the Maginot Line would be suicidal. Instead, they looked to the north. In April 1940, Germany launched a daring invasion of Denmark and Norway to secure iron ore shipments and naval bases. Denmark fell in less than 6 hours. Norway fought back with British help, but by June, they too were under the Nazi boot. The real blow came on May 10, 1940. Using a plan of breathtaking audacity, German forces struck through the Ardennes forest, a region the French had deemed impassable for tanks. The Allied armies were caught completely off guard. The German sickle cut across the French countryside, reaching the English Channel in just 10 days. The cream of the British and French armies was trapped in a shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. The world expected a massacre. But in a moment that defined the British spirit, a call went out for every boat capable of crossing the Channel. From luxury yachts to fishing trawlers, hundreds of civilian vessels braved German fire to ferry their boys home. Over 300,000 soldiers were rescued, living to fight another day. But France was lost. On June 22nd, in the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918, the French government signed an armistice. Hitler danced a jig of joy as the swastika was raised over the Eiffel Tower. Britain was now the last bastion of democracy in Europe. The new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, made it clear that there would be no surrender. He told his people that they would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, and in the streets. He knew that the battle for Britain was about to begin.
The Battle of Britain was the first major campaign to be fought entirely in the air. Hitler knew that before he could launch a seaborne invasion across the English Channel, he had to clear the skies of the Royal Air Force. Throughout the summer of 1940, the world watched as young pilots in Spitfires and Hurricanes rose to meet waves of German bombers. It was a war of technology and nerves. The British had a secret advantage, a network of radar stations that could detect incoming raids before they reached the coast. Despite being outnumbered, the RAF held its ground. Frustrated by the resistance, Hitler shifted his strategy from attacking military airfields to firebombing London and other major cities. This was the Blitz. For 57 consecutive nights, Londoners huddled in the underground as their city burned above them. But instead of breaking their spirit, the attacks forged a new sense of national unity. By October, the Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority, and the invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. It was the first time the Nazi war machine had been stopped. As the stalemate in the West continued, the conflict expanded into the Mediterranean and North Africa. Mussolini, eager to prove Italy's strength, launched an invasion of British-controlled Egypt from his colony in Libya. It was a disaster. The Italian army was poorly equipped and demoralized, and the British quickly counterattacked, taking thousands of prisoners. To save his ally from total collapse, Hitler was forced to intervene. He sent the Afrika Korps, led by the brilliant and charismatic general Erwin Rommel. Known as the Desert Fox, Rommel turned the tide and began a seesaw struggle across the burning sands of the Sahara. The war was no longer just a European affair, it was becoming a global conflagration. While Rommel fought in the desert, Hitler's eyes were already turning toward his ultimate prize in the East. To Hitler, the non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin had always been a temporary marriage of convenience. He viewed the Soviet Union as a land of subhumans and the heart of what he called Jewish Bolshevism. He wanted the vast grain fields of Ukraine and the oil of the Caucasus to fuel his thousand-year Reich. On June 22, 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German and Axis soldiers surged across the Soviet border along a front spanning 2,000 miles. At first, the German success was staggering. The Red Army, purged of its best officers by Stalin's paranoia, was caught completely unprepared. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed in massive pockets. By autumn, German troops could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But the Soviet Union was a land of immense depth and infinite manpower. As the Germans advanced, the Soviets adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying everything that could be of use to the invader. Then, the most formidable ally of the Russian people arrived, the winter. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. German soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, froze to death in their foxholes. Their tanks wouldn't start, and their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The German advance ground to a halt at the gates of Moscow. While the Eastern Front was turning into a slaughterhouse, the United States was moving closer to the edge of the abyss. President Roosevelt faced a difficult balancing act. He knew that a Nazi victory in Europe would leave America isolated and vulnerable, but he had to navigate a public that was still deeply wary of foreign entanglements. He began the Lend-Lease program, which he described as lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. Billions of dollars worth of planes, tanks, and food began flowing to Britain and the Soviet Union. The United States was no longer neutral, it had become the arsenal of democracy. The tension was also rising in the Pacific. Japan, a nation with few natural resources, had been bogged down in a brutal war of conquest in China for years.
To fuel their war machine, they looked toward the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia. However, the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor stood in their way. When the United States imposed an oil embargo on Japan in response to their aggression, the Japanese leadership decided on a desperate gamble. They believed that if they could strike a knockout blow to the American Navy, they could secure their empire before the United States could recover. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the peace of a Hawaiian Sunday was shattered by the roar of Japanese aircraft. In a 2-hour rain of fire, the heart of the American Pacific Fleet was devastated. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, and over 2,000 Americans lost their lives. The next day, President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and the 2 separate conflicts in Europe and Asia merged into a single, truly global struggle. The entry of the United States changed the math of the war. While Japan won victory after victory in the early months of 1942, taking the Philippines, Singapore, and much of the Pacific, the American industrial giant was waking up. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh were converted to wartime production at a speed that defied logic. Women entered the workforce in millions, taking the place of men who had gone to the front. The United States was no longer neutral. It had become the arsenal of democracy. The first major blowback against the Japanese came in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. Through a combination of luck and brilliant code breaking, the American Navy intercepted a Japanese invasion force. In a few minutes of intense aerial combat, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sent to the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese Navy never fully recovered from the loss of its elite pilots and ships. The tide in the Pacific had begun to turn. Back in Europe, the war reached its most horrific peak at the city of Stalingrad. Hitler was obsessed with capturing the city that bore Stalin's name. For 5 months, the 2 armies fought for every house, every cellar, and every pile of rubble. It was a war of snipers and close-quarters brutality. Eventually, the Soviet Union launched a massive pincer movement that trapped the entire German Sixth Army inside the city. Against Hitler's orders, the German commander surrendered in early 1943. It was a catastrophe for the Third Reich. The myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. From that moment on, the German army in the East was in a slow, bloody retreat that would only end in the ruins of Berlin. As the Soviets pushed from the East, the Western Allies were preparing their own counteroffensive. In late 1942, American and British forces landed in North Africa in Operation Torch. This was the first time American troops faced the German army in the West. It was a steep learning curve, but under the leadership of generals like Eisenhower and Patton, the Allies cleared North Africa of Axis forces by May 1943. The next step was the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy. The invasion of Sicily and the subsequent landing on the Italian mainland forced the collapse of Mussolini's government. Mussolini was arrested, and the new Italian government sought peace. But the Germans weren't finished. They rushed troops into Italy, occupying the country and turning the rugged mountain terrain into a series of formidable defensive lines. The fight for Italy would become one of the most grueling and costly campaigns of the war, a slow grind through mud and snow that would last until the final days of the conflict.
By 1944, the world felt like it was held in a state of suspended animation. The Allied grip was tightening, but the heart of the Nazi Empire remained a fortress. While the fighting in the mountains of Italy continued to claim lives in a slow, agonizing crawl, the leaders of the Great Alliance, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, knew that the war could only be won by a direct strike into Northern Europe. The planning for this gamble, known as Operation Overlord, was a feat of logistics and deception unlike anything ever attempted.
Millions of tons of supplies and over 2 million soldiers from a dozen nations gathered in the southern ports of England. They were waiting for a window of clear weather and a chance to change the course of history. As the ground forces prepared, the war in the skies reached a terrifying crescendo. The Allied air forces began a systematic campaign to dismantle the German industrial heartland. During the day, American B-17 flying fortresses braved intense anti-aircraft fire and Luftwaffe interceptors to strike factories and oil refineries with precision. At night, the British Royal Air Force followed, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on German cities to break the will of the population. The sky over Europe was a battlefield of fire and contrails. Thousands of young airmen never returned, but their sacrifice was slowly starving the German war machine of the fuel and machines it needed to survive. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines into the fields of Normandy. As the sun began to rise, the largest armada the world had ever seen appeared off the French coast. Over 5,000 ships carried the hopes of the free world. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped, Allied soldiers stepped into a nightmare of machine gun fire and heavy artillery. On Omaha Beach, the resistance was so fierce that the invasion nearly faltered. But through individual acts of courage and the sheer weight of numbers, the Atlantic Wall was breached. By nightfall, the Allies had a precarious foothold in France. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. The German response was hampered by confusion and Hitler's refusal to release his armored reserves. The Allies expanded their bridgehead, breaking out of the hedgerows of Normandy and racing across the French countryside. In August, the people of Paris rose up against their occupiers, and the city was liberated to scenes of wild jubilation. It seemed as though the war in the West might be over by Christmas, but the Nazi regime was not ready to collapse just yet. They retreated to the borders of the fatherland, digging in for a final desperate defense. While the Western Front grabbed the world's headlines, a storm of even greater magnitude was breaking in the East. In late June 1944, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration. This was a massive offensive designed to coincide with the landings in Normandy. It was a masterclass in modern warfare. The Red Army, now a highly professional and well-equipped force, smashed through the German Army Group center. In just a few weeks, the German front line in the east simply evaporated. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. The Soviets surged forward, crossing into Poland and reaching the outskirts of Warsaw. The scale of the destruction was so vast that it made the fighting in the West look like a skirmish. As the Allies closed in from both sides, the true horror of the Nazi regime was finally revealed to the world. Advancing Soviet and Western troops began to stumble upon the concentration camps. At places like Majdanek and Auschwitz, they found the skeletal survivors and the industrial-scale machinery of the Holocaust. The piles of shoes, the human hair, and the chimneys of the crematoriums told a story of depravity that was almost impossible to process. The soldiers who liberated these camps were forever changed by what they saw. The war was no longer just about territory or politics. It was a crusade against an absolute evil. In December 1944, Hitler made one last desperate attempt to win the war in the West. He gathered his remaining panzer divisions and launched a surprise attack through the snowy forests of the Ardennes. He hoped to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. In the freezing cold, American soldiers found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. At the town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division held out against repeated attacks, famously responding to a German surrender demand with a single word: nuts. General Patton performed a logistical miracle, pivoting his Third Army in the middle of a winter storm to relieve the besieged troops. The German gamble failed, and their last reserves were exhausted. By early 1945, the end was inevitable. The Allies crossed the Rhine River into the heart of Germany. In the east, the Red Army launched its final assault toward Berlin. The German people, who had once cheered Hitler's victories, were now experiencing the horrors of war in their own streets. Millions of refugees fled westward to escape the advancing Soviets. In the underground bunker in Berlin, a broken and delusional Hitler moved imaginary armies on a map, refusing to accept that his thousand-year Reich was crumbling around him. The Battle of Berlin was a brutal house-to-house struggle. The city was a wasteland of ruins, defended by old men and young boys of the Hitler Youth. On April 30th, as Soviet soldiers were only blocks away, Adolf Hitler took his own life. A few days later, on May 7th, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The continent was a graveyard, with millions dead and cities reduced to rubble. VE Day was celebrated with tears and dancing in the streets of London, New York, and Moscow. But even as the lights came back on in Europe, the shadow of war still hung over the Pacific. The Americans had been island-hopping toward Japan, winning bloody victories at places like Saipan and Leyte Gulf. The Japanese Navy was effectively destroyed, but the spirit of the Japanese military remained unbroken. They turned to desperate tactics, launching kamikaze suicide attacks against American ships. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa showed the Americans what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost. Thousands of Marines died for every square mile of volcanic rock. The human cost of a final invasion was estimated in the millions. This was the terrifying context in which the newly sworn-in President Harry Truman faced the most difficult decision in history. In the deserts of New Mexico, a group of scientists had successfully tested a weapon of unimaginable power. The Manhattan Project had produced the atomic bomb. Truman was told that using this weapon could end the war quickly and save countless American lives. On August 6, 1945, a lone B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. A single bomb was dropped. In an instant, 70,000 people were vaporized, and a city was erased from the map. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The world had entered the nuclear age. Faced with total annihilation and the entry of the Soviet Union into the war against them, the Japanese leadership finally surrendered. On September 2, 1945, on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal documents were signed. The greatest conflict in human history had finally come to an end. The cost was 60 million lives and a world that would never be the same again.
The silence that followed the signing on the deck of the Missouri was unlike any the world had ever known. It was the silence of exhaustion, of grief, and of a profound realization that the old world was gone forever. As the soldiers began the long journey home, they returned to a landscape that had been physically and morally reshaped. The reconstruction of a broken planet was a task almost as daunting as the war itself. Europe was a continent of displaced persons, with millions of refugees wandering through the ruins of their former lives, searching for families that often no longer existed. In the wake of such unprecedented destruction, the victors were determined that this time the mistakes of 1919 would not be repeated. Instead of just demanding reparations, the Allies sought to hold the individuals responsible for the atrocities accountable. The Nuremberg trials were established, marking the first time in history that a nation's leaders were put on trial for crimes against humanity.
High-ranking Nazi officials sat in the dock, forced to face the evidence of their industrial-scale genocide. The trials established a new precedent in international law that following orders was no excuse for participating in mass murder. Similar trials were held in Tokyo as the world tried to find a path toward justice in a world scarred by darkness. While the trials sought to address the past, the Marshall Plan looked toward the future. The United States, now the world's undisputed economic powerhouse, realized that a destitute Europe would be a breeding ground for further conflict and radicalism. In an act of unprecedented generosity and strategic foresight, billions of dollars were poured into the rebuilding of Western Europe. Factories were rebuilt, infrastructure was restored, and democratic institutions were nurtured. This investment transformed former enemies into some of America's closest allies and sparked an economic miracle that would define the post-war era. However, the unity of the Great Alliance was short-lived. Even before the last shots were fired, the ideological cracks between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union had begun to widen. Stalin, having lost 27 million people in the war, was determined to create a buffer zone of satellite states in Eastern Europe. An iron curtain, as Winston Churchill famously described it, was descending across the continent. The shared goal of defeating Hitler was replaced by a tense global competition for influence. This was the birth of the Cold War, a struggle that would dominate the next 4 decades and bring the world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe more than once. The map of the world was also being redrawn beyond Europe. The war had shattered the myth of European colonial invincibility. In Asia and Africa, independence movements that had been simmering for decades now boiled over. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and dozens of other nations began their journey toward sovereignty. The age of the great maritime empires was over, replaced by a new world order defined by the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The legacy of World War II is etched into every facet of our modern lives. It gave birth to the United Nations, an organization built on the hope that dialogue could prevent another global slaughter. It accelerated technological leaps that led to the jet age, the space race, and the computer revolution. It fundamentally changed the role of women in society and laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements that would follow. But most importantly, the war serves as a permanent reminder of the fragility of civilization. It showed us the terrifying power of hatred and the catastrophic cost of silence in the face of tyranny. We remember the stories of the farm boys from Iowa who stormed the beaches of Normandy, the factory workers in the Urals who built tanks in the freezing dark, and the resistance fighters who risked everything for a glimmer of freedom. Their collective sacrifice bought the world a second chance. As we look back on those 6 years of fire and steel, the message remains clear. Peace is not merely the absence of war, it is a constant, active pursuit. The story of World War II is the story of humanity at its absolute worst and its absolute best. It is a story of how a world nearly lost its soul and the incredible price that was paid to win it back. It is a history that must be told and retold so that the shadows of the past never again grow long enough to swallow the light of the future.
Beyond the statistics and the massive movements of armies, the true heartbeat of this story lies in the quiet, individual moments of courage that defined an entire generation. We often speak of the war in the abstract, but it was won by ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. It was won by the 19-year-old medic crawling through the mud of Okinawa, the French grandmother hiding a downed pilot in her cellar, and the code breakers in a quiet English manor house who turned mathematical riddles into the keys to victory.
These were people who didn't set out to be heroes. They simply decided that a world ruled by fear was not a world worth living in. They carried the weight of the future on their shoulders, and they did not buckle. The echoes of their struggle are still audible today if we listen closely enough. We hear them in the foundations of our international laws, in the borders of our nations, and in the very freedoms we often take for granted. The greatest generation, as they came to be known, returned home not to claim glory, but to build. They built the suburbs, the highways, and the modern world we now inhabit. They carried the scars of what they had seen, the smoke of burning cities, and the hollow eyes of the liberated. Yet they chose to look forward. Their legacy is not just the peace they won, but the responsibility they handed down to us. They proved that when humanity stands united against the darkness, the light will eventually prevail, no matter how long the night. As the veterans of this conflict pass into history, the duty of remembrance falls to us. We are the guardians of their stories. We must remember that democracy is not a self-sustaining machine, but a garden that requires constant care. We must remember that the path to catastrophe begins with the first step of dehumanizing our neighbor. The story of World War II serves as a profound warning and a brilliant beacon. It warns us of what happens when we let hate go unchecked, and it beacons us toward a future where we choose cooperation over conflict. It reminds us that even in the deepest winter of the human spirit, there is an invincible summer waiting to be born. We look back one last time at the maps, the grainy black and white films, and the rows of white crosses in silent cemeteries from Normandy to Manila. These are not just relics of the past, they are the price of our present. The war ended in 1945, but its lessons are eternal. It taught us that no tyrant is invincible, no cause is lost if brave souls remain to fight for it, and no darkness is so thick that a single candle of truth cannot pierce it. This was the era when the world was pushed to the very edge of the abyss and found the strength to pull itself back. This has been the full story of World War II, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a tribute to the millions who gave their today so that we could have our tomorrow. Their journey is over, but our journey to protect the world they saved is just beginning. As the sun sets on this chapter of history, let us carry their torch with honor, with gratitude, and with an unwavering resolve to never let such a fire burn again. The world was changed forever in those 6 years of struggle, and it is up to us to ensure it was changed for the better. History is watching, and the story continues with us.